Hi, everybody. We're going to talk about the Carolinas and Georgia today, so that way we can get through that and move on to New England next class. So everything that's underlined is the things that you should note. So just make sure that you're underlining that, and you can pause the video as you go through. So I'm going to try to talk really fast, get through it, and then you can pause it and write down the important things. So we're going to talk about the Carolinas, and the Carolinas, there's a little bit of a stop in colonization after the founding of a couple of New England colonies, and then also Maryland, which we talked about last week, because the English Civil War happened. So from 1642 to 1651, English Civil War takes place. They kill the king, King Charles I. This guy, Oliver Cromwell, he creates an army and takes over, defeats the royalist forces. And then for 10 years, this guy Cromwell rules, and basically it was just a disaster. So after 10 years, Englishmen were tired of the rule of Oliver Cromwell. He passes away, his son takes over, he's even worse. So there was this whole movement to restore Charles II to the throne. So it's called the Restoration, and it interrupted colonization. So if you notice, like the English Civil War is underlined, and then also interrupted colonization. So for a little while, England was not focused on adding more colonies and sending people overseas. There were a lot of people that left England because of the Civil War, but like they weren't really too concerned with that. So after it was over, actually I should have underlined this part down here, the Restoration colonies. So if you want to make note of that. So the Restoration colonies were the colonies that were founded in the late 17th century during a period known as the Restoration, where they restored, the name refers to the restoration of the power of the English monarch. Right? So for a while, there was no monarchy, and Charles II in 1660 is going to be restored to the throne, hence the name the Restoration. So these colonies, North Carolina, South Carolina, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, and Georgia, are all considered to be the Restoration colonies because they were created after the Restoration. All right, so once there's Charles II, he's looking pretty nice there on his throne with his hair. All right, so Charles II granted 8 proprietors. The 8 proprietors, so it's kind of like how in Maryland we said it was a proprietary colony, it was an owner. So for the Carolinas, which was a really large colony, they had 8 men who are going to be called proprietors. And it's basically all the land south of Virginia to Spanish Florida. So in 1663, they're going to be granted a charter. And these men all helped Charles II gain the throne again. And so it basically became known as the Carolinas or Carolina Colony because it was named after Charles. Carolus is the Latinized version of the name Charles, so they called it Carolina. And there's like lots of different dates that go along with Carolina because once it was one big colony, and then eventually it's going to be divided into 2. So like I said, it was named. So it was divided into 2 colonies in 1712, and then they kind of changed the boundaries a little bit again in 1729. So like there's some different dates, but they officially became North Carolina and South Carolina in 1712. And we'll talk about why it ended up separating. So here's a map. Now this is like the 1600s version. So actually you could see this is all the Outer Banks right here. Here's Roanoke Inlet, here's Roanoke Island. So it's actually like on its side, but this was just supposed to be a map of the coast. So you can see like Hilton's Head right here, so Hilton Head Island, and then it kind of goes all the way along the North Carolina coast. So we're kind of taking a look at that area, and then this is what another version of what Carolina was. So Carolina actually included Georgia before Georgia became its own colony. So depending on like whose map you're looking at, there's different lines. Like this colonial charter was in 1663. This one's 2 years later, 1665, but that's going to Spanish Florida. So the Spanish weren't too happy about that. But the actual charter itself is going to go all the way up here to the coast of Virginia. So it wasn't really, it's all this area before it was separated into the 2 different parts. All right, so South Carolina, in 1670, colonists started making their way from England. And then also there were a couple of planters who lived on the island of Barbados, which was a British island, British colony. And meant there was actually like a shortage of land basically in Barbados. It's a tiny little island. So you have a lot of planters that decide that they're going to go to the Carolinas. They also wanted to have a port set up in the Carolinas so that they could send their sugarcane and other products to North American colonies on the mainland. So they actually named their town Charlestown right here after King Charles. So that was the first settlement. Today it's Charleston, but back then it was Charlestown. And they wanted to use it as a port to send their products to other parts of the colonies. And they needed a good port to do that. So initially, the economy was based upon trading furs and providing food for the West Indies. So they were sending down crops they were growing that were not being grown in the West Indies. And then by 1700s, specifically, large rice growing plantations were forming that were worked by enslaved Africans. So in South Carolina, they did not use indentured servants in the same capacity that they did in Virginia and Maryland. They actually went right to African slaves because many of the planters living in Barbados, they already had African slaves since that was the source of labor being used in the West Indies at that point. So by the middle of the 18th century, so mid 1700s, there were a lot of Africans living in South Carolina, and the culture also kind of resembles the culture of Barbados and some of the islands. So we see a lot of African rituals and just the lifestyle. So it was very similar to Barbados because of that. All right, so the primary, so that should be, this is all just continuing on with Carolinas. Actually, this should be South Carolina, so I didn't change that. So the primary export is rice in South Carolina. And it was still an exotic food in England. It was still something that was kind of fashionable. Like if you had rice at your meal and you had people over, like it was like a really cool thing to do, basically. So rice was very, very exotic. And so it was in pretty high demand. It was grown in Africa, so planters imported West African slaves because many West Africans knew how to grow the rice. And these slaves had a genetic trait that made them immune to malaria, so they didn't die like the indentured servants did and other settlers when they came to the Carolinas because there were a lot of mosquitoes in South Carolina. And there were so many slaves being imported into the colonies that by 1710, so really not that far into the founding of South Carolina, they had that black slaves were actually a majority Carolina. So it was more black slaves than white settlers living in the Carolinas by 1710. So here's an example of a rice plantation. So you have the slaves working in the fields. Here's the white overseer. So pretty typical thing that you would see in South Carolina at that point. Here's a painting from the time period, and it shows the title is basically it's African slaves on South Carolina rice plantation. That's what it is, and it was painted in the early 1700s. I forget the exact date, and you can see they're using like a lot of like the West African instruments, like the banjo actually was West African, and other types of drums and dances. So that was all pretty common. So the second main crop is indigo, and indigo is just a plant here with flowers on, and the flowers they use to create a dark blue dye, and that also became pretty fashionable to have clothes that were dyed with indigo, this deep blue. And I mean, it's supposed to be circled over here. I guess it was moved a little bit, but this is a shirt that was dyed with indigo, and then over here as well. All right, so here showing the rice and indigo exports from South Carolina and Georgia. You can see that rice by the 1700s just starts to increase, and there's fluctuations throughout the 1740s and 50s and 60s, but it's going to continue to go up and be the main export from South Carolina by 1770. All right, so North Carolina, actually North Carolina was settled before the Restoration because there were a lot of former indentured servants that are going to get out of their indentured contracts, like we talked about last week, and they're looking for land. So many of them leave Virginia and go south. And at that point, like, there's nobody living in Carolina except for Native Americans. So many of them are going to settle right over the border from Virginia. And like the first colony is New Bern. Well, the first settlement is New Bern. And so what these people do is they just basically take over land. They don't pay for it. And they become what's known as squatters. And so they just take the land, they farm it, they grow tobacco, and they try to make a living. And they don't own slaves because they can't afford it. So this is one of the reasons why we see the separation between North Carolina and South Carolina, because you have two different groups of Carolinians that develop. Number one, aristocratic and wealthier down south around Charleston that had the rice and indigo plantations. Many of them from Barbados and also from England. So just coming over, having money to begin with, and then being able to buy these large plots of land. And then up north, you have the strong-willed and independent-minded former indentured servants or just poor settlers that maybe can't really buy a really good piece of land. So they moved to North Carolina. And it wasn't easy farming in North Carolina. The soil was definitely different than in South Carolina. It was rockier. You had to clear the land first, and it was very forested area. But once they did that, many of these people were very successful. So part of the reason why they separated was because there was a large population right with the border with Virginia, and then there was a large population all the way up the southern part of the Carolinas around Charleston or Charlestown. And so if having a government that was in Charlestown for many North Carolinians was just not convenient. So there was a push to form a new colony and just separate this large colony into two, and then that way it would be easier to govern. And also a lot of South Carolinians didn't want to associate with some of the North Carolinians because they were squatters, they were former indentured servants. So it was also kind of like a socioeconomic status thing. And so they decided to separate it into two colonies. All right, so poor transportation in North Carolina. They didn't have many passable roads, and they also didn't have really good harbors, mostly because of the Outer Banks being on the coast, and it was hard for ships to get in and out because there wasn't just a direct way to get into the harbors in North Carolina. So there was fewer plantations because it was more difficult for people to ship their goods and also to import things. So North Carolina did not have as many large plantations, and it also had less slavery as compared to South Carolina because many of the people that moved there were poor, former indentured servants. They couldn't afford slaves, so they just worked the land themselves. And in 1711, I just want to note, there was a Tuscarora War between the Tuscarora Indians and the New Bern settlement, which was the first settlement in North Carolina. And the Carolinians responded by crushing the Native Americans, the Tuscarora Indians who attacked, and selling hundreds of them into slavery. And the rest are going to wander north, eventually becoming part of the Six Nation of the Iroquois. And this is a drawing showing New Bern being burnt by the Native Americans. All right, so here's a map showing the different settlements. This is pretty much all the southern colonies except for Maryland. So you have Jamestown, 1607. Here's New Bern, North Carolina in 1710. Charleston, South Carolina in 1670. And then Savannah, Georgia in 1733. So let's talk about Georgia. So Georgia was the last colony to be developed, or settled, I should say. It was settled in 1732 by wealthy philanthropists. So just people that were looking for a place to send convicts, because once again, the jails in England were really overcrowded. And so there were a lot of people who said, well, indentured servant, there's no more indentured servants that are heading to the colonies. Like that whole system broke down, and we'll talk more about that later on. But it broke down, and so they needed a place to send debtors and convicts, other people, not necessarily dangerous criminals, but just people that, like we said, maybe they were arrested for theft, and that was considered to be a punishable offense. But there was so much of that going on that they had no place in the prison. So James Oglethorpe, who was a philanthropist, also a member of parliament, suggested that they create a colony that was just for convicts. And also, there were some raids by Spanish settlers, raids by Native Americans that were crossing the border from Florida into what was at that point Carolina. And a lot of people living in Carolina wanted some sort of protection. They wanted some sort of settlement in between that was going to protect them and their interests from some of those people that were in Spanish Florida. So Georgia was intended to be a buffer between the British colonies, Spanish Florida, like I said, Spanish Indians, and there also were many runaway slaves making their way to Spanish Florida because the Spanish promised them freedom, and also French Louisiana, which was to the west. So they wanted some sort of colony in between, and they wanted a place to send debtors to relieve overcrowding in prisons. So Georgia was set up as a place to send convicts and also as a buffer. So the first settlement was Savannah in 1733. And here's a painting showing the trustees of Georgia. And it was the last of the colonies. It was the only one to receive direct financial support from the government in London because it was supposed to be a place for defensive buffer. and they needed to send soldiers there. So it was going to be that was going to be funded by the government directly. They wanted to protect those prosperous South Carolina plantations from the threat of Spanish Florida. And the other purpose of it was thousands of people, like I said, were being imprisoned for debt. So they wanted a place to send all these people. So they were going to receive, Georgia was going to receive subsidies from the British government to offset costs of defense. So basically, the government was going to be paying for the protection of Georgia, which wasn't the case for a lot of the other colonies. So they had a lot of restrictions. They allowed all Christians except Catholics. There's those Catholics again were being persecuted and not really welcome everywhere. Would enjoy religious toleration. So basically, all Protestants would enjoy religious toleration. They grew rice and indigo, just like South Carolina. Oops, sorry. It did not thrive, though. That was the main issue. So even though Oglethorpe acted as the colony's first governor and put in an elaborate plan for making the colony thrive, there were strict regulations, including the bans on drinking rum. There was also a ban on slavery. And nevertheless, because of all these restrictions and also the constant Spanish threat, of an attack, the colony just did not prosper. So in 1752, Oglethorpe and his group gave up on their plan because of mismanagement and just a lot of other issues happening. There were still attacks by Native Americans and Spanish, and it was just a huge issue. So it was taken over by the British government, and Georgia became a royal colony. And the restrictions on rum and slavery and other things were dropped, and the colony grew slowly. So even by like the American Revolution, it was still like forming, and the population was really slow, was really small, and it's going to be the smallest and poorest of the 13 colonies. Okay, so that is pretty much it for the colonies, southern colonies, I should say. We still have to talk about New England and the middle colonies, which we'll do next week. Well, actually, the end of this week and next week. So make sure that you underline, you write down everything that was underlined, and I'll see you in a couple of days.